The words landed like a slap across a quiet room. Clara Whitmore heard them clearly, too clearly, over the soft clinking of wine glasses and the gentle murmur of a Friday evening crowd at Maison Elise, one of the city's finest restaurants. She had arrived 12 minutes early, wearing her emerald green wrap dress that her daughter said made her look absolutely timeless. Her dark hair curled softly at the shoulders, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she waited. She had been nervous, yes, the kind of nervous that lives in the chest and makes breathing feel like a learned skill rather than a natural one. But she had been hopeful too. At 43 years old, after 4 years of quiet, aching loneliness following her divorce, Clara Whitmore had finally let herself be hopeful again. And then the man across from her, the man her colleague had set her up with through a dating app, the man who had seemed so charming in his messages, leaned back in his chair, looked her over with the casual indifference of someone inspecting furniture, and said to his phone, rather than to her face, that he didn't think this was going to work out because, and these were his exact words, she was a little too old for what he had in mind. He hadn't even ordered yet. He hadn't even asked her name. If you believe that every person deserves dignity, kindness, and a real chance at love, no matter their age, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know. Now let's get into the story. Clara did not cry. That was the first thing. She had cried enough in the years after her marriage fell apart. Cried in parking lots and shower stalls, and once, memorably, in the cereal aisle of a grocery store because she had reached for the brand her ex-husband used to love and then remembered there was no reason to anymore. She had used up a particular reservoir of tears, and in its place had grown something quieter and more resilient. Though tonight it was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. She simply sat very still, the way she had learned to sit still during depositions when she worked as a legal translator, keeping her face neutral and her hands calm, while the man, whose name was Marcus, though she was already beginning to forget it, scrolled through his phone and muttered something about calling a car. He didn't look at her again. He simply gathered his jacket from the back of the chair, gave a vague half-wave in her direction, and walked out of Maison Elise as though she were a wrong turn he had made on an otherwise pleasant drive. The waiter, a young man named Theo, with kind eyes, appeared at the table almost immediately and asked if she would like anything while she waited. She almost said she wasn't waiting for anyone anymore, but instead, she heard herself order a glass of burgundy and the mushroom risotto. Because she had driven 40 minutes to get here, she had paid $12 to park, and she was hungry, and she was not going to let a thoughtless man take her dinner from her as well. It was a small act of defiance, barely visible to anyone watching. But to Clara, sitting alone at a table set for two in a restaurant full of couples leaning toward each other over candlelight, it felt enormous. She was perhaps 10 minutes into her solitude, the wine warming her slightly, the ambient noise of the restaurant wrapping around her like something almost comfortable, when she became aware that the man at the table beside her was watching. Not in an intrusive way, not the kind of watching that makes a woman's skin tighten with discomfort. It was quieter than that. She caught it only because she happened to glance sideways while reaching for her glass, and she found that the man, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing a blue blazer over a deep red shirt, seated alone himself, was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was closer to recognition, the look of someone who has witnessed something they understand from the inside. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Ren Calloway. He was 47 years old. He was a structural engineer who had spent the last 2 years rebuilding his professional life after his firm collapsed during the economic downturn, and the last 3 years navigating the particular silence of a man who had been so consumed by work and financial crisis that he had not noticed his marriage dissolving around him until the papers were already drawn up and his wife, his high school sweetheart, the woman he had loved with the uncomplicated certainty of youth, was packing boxes in the bedroom while he sat in the kitchen not knowing what to say. He had come to Maison Elise tonight because his therapist had suggested, gently but persistently, that eating alone at home every Friday night was becoming a habit dressed up as a preference. He had brought a book he wasn't reading. He had ordered a meal he was barely tasting. And then the man across from the dark-haired woman in the green dress had said something into his phone that Ren heard with a clarity that made his jaw tighten. He had heard it all. The table arrangement at Maison Elise put them close enough that private conversations were not truly private, and the man, Marcus, though Ren didn't know his name either, had spoken with the careless volume of someone who had never had to worry about being overheard. Ren had watched the woman's face as Marcus spoke. He had watched the way she went absolutely still, the way a person goes still not from shock but from practice, from having learned that stillness is sometimes the only armor available. He had watched Marcus leave without looking back. And something in Ren Calloway, something that had been sitting quiet and heavy in his chest for years, rose up with a suddenness that surprised him. He did not plan what happened next. He was not a dramatic man by nature. He was the kind of person who thought carefully before speaking, who measured his words and his actions, who had once been told by a colleague that he was the most deliberate person she had ever met, which she had meant as a compliment, though he wasn't entirely sure. But deliberate or not, Ren found himself pushing back his chair and standing up before any conscious decision had been made, and he heard himself say, across the small distance between their tables, that he hoped she would forgive the interruption, but that he had witnessed what just happened, and he thought she deserved to hear from at least one person tonight that the man who left was the one who had lost something. Clara looked up at him. Later, she would think about this moment, would return to it the way you return to a particular photograph, holding it up to different lights to see what else it contains. She looked up at this stranger standing beside the adjacent table, this man with steady eyes and a slightly uncertain expression that suggested he was already second-guessing whether he should have spoken, and something in the careful formality of what he had said. The way he had chosen each word, the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, undid her more completely than Marcus's cruelty had. Her eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her wine glass for a moment. Then she looked back up and said that he was very kind and that she was fine, even though they both understood that fine was a word people use when they are not ready to say what they actually feel. Ren asked if she would mind if he joined her, not to intrude, he said, and not out of any motive she should feel uncomfortable about, but simply because eating alone was something both of them appeared to be doing tonight, and the company seemed like it might be welcome. It was such an honest, unadorned request, so free of performance or strategy, that Clara said yes before she had time to be cautious about it. He picked up his plate and his book and his half-finished glass of water and relocated them to her table with the straightforward efficiency of a man rearranging a workspace. And then he sat down and introduced himself, and she told him her name, and the evening became something neither of them had arrived expecting. They talked. That was all, and it was everything. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing for each other, which usually takes months but sometimes happens in minutes when the circumstances are the right kind of honest. Clara told him she was a legal translator, French and Italian, occasionally Portuguese, and that she had spent most of her career working between languages, living in the spaces where meaning crossed over from one world into another, which she had always thought was a strange sort of skill, because it required you to be fully inside two things at once without belonging completely to either. Ren said that sounded, unexpectedly, exactly like structural engineering, because his entire profession was about understanding how different forces acted on each other at their points of contact, how the places where things met were always the most complicated and the most important. Clara looked at him when he said this. She looked at him the way you look at someone when they have said something that reorganizes a small piece of the world. He told her about his firm collapsing and the years of rebuilding. He told her about his marriage ending and the particular loneliness of watching something you loved become something you couldn't reach, even while it was still in the same house. He didn't dramatize it. He spoke about it the way you speak about a hard winter, as something that happened, that was real, that changed the landscape, that you eventually moved through. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone who translated for a living, who understood that meaning lived not just in words, but in the pauses between them, and she heard in what Ren said not sadness exactly, but something more like earned honesty, the kind of truth a person arrives at only after they have stopped pretending. She told him about her own divorce, about the marriage that had been good for a long time and then, quietly, inexplicably, had stopped being good. Not because of any single dramatic failure, but because two people had grown in directions that no longer overlapped, and one day she had looked across the breakfast table at the man she had built her life with and understood that they were strangers who happened to share a house and a daughter and a coffee maker and nothing much else. She told him that the loneliness after was different from any loneliness she had known before, because it lived inside a shape that used to hold something else. And empty shapes are harder than simple emptiness. Ren was quiet for a moment after she said this, and then he said yes, quietly, as though she had described something he had carried for years without having the words for it. Her risotto arrived, and then his steak, and they ate and talked, and the candle between them burned lower, and the restaurant around them gradually thinned as couples finished their evenings and moved out into the night. Clara noticed at some point that she had stopped being aware of the empty chair across from her, the ghost of Marcus and his phone and his careless departure, and had become aware instead of the particular quality of attention that Ren brought to every word she said, the way he tracked what she was saying not to prepare his response but simply to understand, the way her ex-husband almost never had. She noticed that she had stopped performing okayness and had simply become, incrementally and without deciding to, actually okay. Theo brought dessert menus, and Clara ordered the pear tart almost without looking because she had been looking at Ren while he described the building he was most proud of designing. A community center in a small coastal town. Nothing glamorous, he said, just concrete and glass and good bones, but built to last. And she thought that there was something in the way he talked about making things last that moved her in a way she wasn't prepared to examine too closely yet. He ordered coffee. They stayed. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the restaurant began turning off its softer lights, the gentle signal that Maison Elise was winding toward closing. Clara looked around as though surfacing from deep water and laughed softly at how thoroughly she had lost track of time, and Ren smiled. A full smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and said he hadn't noticed either, and that he thought this was probably a good sign. They walked out together into the cool night air and stood on the sidewalk in that particular suspended moment when an evening has been good enough that ending it feels like a loss, but extending it requires a kind of courage. Ren said that he would very much like to do this again. Not a blind date, he said, not a setup, not an algorithm's best guess, but simply two people who had found each other accidentally in a restaurant and discovered that accidentally was sometimes better than arranged. He said it quietly and looked at her steadily when he said it, and Clara thought about how she had almost not come tonight, how she had stood in front of her mirror in the green dress and thought about calling it off, about saying she was tired or unwell, about choosing the safety of her quiet apartment over the risk of exactly the kind of evening that Marcus had almost delivered. She thought about how close she had come to not being here at all. She gave Ren her number. He put it in his phone and then did something she didn't expect. He looked at it for a moment as though making sure it was real, as though he wanted to be certain this was actually happening, and she recognized that gesture from the inside, the cautious hope of someone who has been lonely long enough to half disbelieve good things when they arrive. They said goodnight. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, hands in her lap, the city moving quietly around her. And she thought about Marcus and his phone and his careless words. Too old, he had said, as though she were a piece of fruit past its best days. And she thought about the years she had spent in the aftermath of her divorce, believing, in a low and persistent way she rarely admitted even to herself, that he might have been right, that she might have become somehow past the point of being chosen, past the point of being seen. And she thought about a man in a blue blazer who had put down his book and stood up from his table because he thought she deserved to hear something true. She thought about how the most significant moments often arrive not as dramatic rescues, but as simple, quiet acts of one person choosing to witness another. She drove home through lit streets feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not giddy, not the breathless excitement of a first beginning, but something deeper and more durable. The particular warmth of being recognized, of being found, of discovering, at 43 years old, in an emerald green dress in a restaurant that smelled of garlic and candle wax, that the story was still going, that it had perhaps only just reached the part worth telling. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or told in some way that your time had passed, please like this video right now. Share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness still exists and love still finds people when they've stopped forcing it. Leave a comment and tell us what part of Clara's story stayed with you. Every like, every share, every kind word in the comments tells us to keep telling these stories. And perhaps that is the truest thing about second chances. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive wrapped in certainty or fanfare. They arrive in the space between one thing ending and another beginning, in the quiet moment when someone chooses to stand up rather than look away, when someone chooses to see you not as a remainder of what you used to be, but as the whole, complete, worthy person you are right now. Marcus walked out and thought he had made a simple, reasonable decision. He had no idea that in leaving, he had made room for something real. He had no idea that the woman he dismissed without a second glance would sit across a candle-lit table from a man who actually listened, and that somewhere between the risotto and the pear tart and 2 long hours of genuine conversation, Clara Whitmore, who had driven 40 minutes and paid $12 to park and almost turned around twice on the way, had quietly, unexpectedly begun to come home to herself. Before you go, drop a comment with just one word that describes how this story made you feel. One word. We read every single one. Written for every person who was ever told they were too much or too little or too late. You are none of those things. You are exactly on time.